Lesson, we're going to be going over SAT boundaries questions, which is part of Unit 11 on Khan Academy. So let's start with linking clauses. What are clauses? A clause is a series of words that contain a subject and verb. There are two main types of clauses. An independent clause can stand on its own as a complete sentence. So, for example, Dolores went to the grocery store. This has the subject, which is Dolores, and the verb, which is went, and it makes sense on its own as a sentence, right? A dependent clause, although it has a subject and verb, it can't stand out on its own as a complete sentence. It doesn't make sense on its own. So, for example, where she bought milk and eggs, this doesn't make sense as its own sentence, right? So that means that we need to link it to an independent clause. The way that would work is something like this. Dolores went to the grocery store where she bought milk and eggs. We have this independent clause and it's linked to the dependent clause with a comma. The SAT focuses on how clauses can be linked together or kept apart. These conventions may be tested in boundaries questions that you encounter on test day. Linking clauses. There are several ways to link clauses. The SAT focuses on end of sentence punctuation, coordination, subordination, and semicolons. Let's look at each one. So first, end of sentence punctuation. Using end punctuation like a period or question mark is the simplest way to separate clauses. You should be familiar with using end punctuation in your own writing. There are only two rules. First is that the punctuation mark must match the function of the sentence it follows. So that just means that if you have, like a question, then use a question mark. But if it's not a question, then don't use a question mark. Stuff like that, right? So, for example, I've often wondered how are birds able to navigate. This isn't a question, this is a statement, right? So, there's no need for a question mark at the end. You should have a period instead, right? The incorrect version confuses the purpose of the sentence, phrasing the second half like a question and ending things with a question mark. The correct version appropriately phrases a sentence to function as a statement, ending things with a period. So again, this is incorrect because this is a statement. There's no need for a question mark. This is correct. We use the correct end punctuation here. The second rule for end punctuation is that it can only be used to separate two independent clauses. So this is incorrect. After sliced bread was introduced to the market in 1928, it quickly eclipsed the popularity of unsliced bread. This is a dependent clause, right? You can't link this dependent clause with and this part here after is independent, but you can't link an independent clause and a dependent clause using a end punctuation like a period, right? So something like this would be correct. After sliced bread was introduced to the market in 1928, this is a dependent clause, and notice how we're linking with a comma to the independent clause over here. So we can use a comma to link an independent and dependent clause because comma is not end punctuation. However, a period is end punctuation. And again, you don't use end punctuation to link an independent and dependent clause. All right, coordination. Coordination involves the linking of two independent clauses within a single sentence. To coordinate independent clauses, we must use two things, a comma and a coordinating conjunction. The coordinating conjunctions are known as fanboys. This is how you can remember them, alright? For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So, for example, if we want to link two independent clauses, this would be incorrect. Astronomical seasons are based on the position of the sun. Meteorological seasons are based on temperature and weather. This is an independent clause, right? And this is also an independent clause. But we're linking them with only a comma. We would need a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So this is correct. Astronomical seasons are based on the position of the sun, but meteorological seasons are based on temperature and weather. Actually, sorry, this is also incorrect. I just realized that because notice how although this one does use the coordinating conjunction to link the two independent clauses, there's no comma, right? So when you're linking two independent clauses, you need both a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So this is the correct version. Astronomical seasons are based on the position of the sun, comma, but meteorological seasons are based on temperature and weather. Notice how this here, this is an independent clause, and this is a comma and coordinating conjunction, and then this is the dependent. This is also an independent clause. So we have two independent clauses shown in yellow, and this green part is the comma and coordinating conjunction that we're using to link those independent clauses. So remember that the way that you generally link two independent clauses or connect them together is using a comma and coordinating conjunction. Alright, subordination. Subordination involves linking two clauses by making one of the clauses dependent. To subordinate an independent clause, we must use two things: a subordinating conjunction and a comma. Subordinating conjunctions are words that turn an independent clause into a dependent clause. There are many subordinating conjunctions, but some examples include although, since, because, while, when, and after. So while this first method, coordination, what we were doing here was we were linking two independent clauses using a comma and a coordinating conjunction. In this case, we're using a subordinating conjunction and a comma, but we're using it to link an independent clause and a dependent clause, or we're making one of the independent clauses dependent. So for example, this would be incorrect. Broccoli, kale, and kohlrabi may seem like very different vegetables. They are all cultivars of the same plant species. So this is incorrect because this is an independent clause, right? This is also an independent clause, but we're linking them with only a comma. So one way that we could do this, if we wanted to correct this, if we wanted to correct this error where we're linking two independent clauses with only a comma, one thing that we could do is add a coordinating conjunction, right? So we have first independent clause and second independent clause, right? I'll do the second one in orange, first one is in yellow. What I need to do is I could just add this coordinating conjunction but, right? So now I have independent clause 1, I have comma and coordinating conjunction, and I have independent clause 2. This works, right? This is one method of doing it. But that's called coordination, right? The method that we're doing now is called subordination. So let's see how that would look like. Though broccoli, kale, and kohlrabi may seem like very different vegetables, they are all cultivars of the same plant species. So the way that we did this one was we added the word though in front of the first clause, and that made it dependent, right? So let's take this, right? Notice how this was our first clause initially, right? Broccoli, kale, and kohlrabi may seem like very different vegetables. This here is an independent clause, right? It can stand on its own. However, if we add the word though in front of it, this now is a dependent clause, right? Though broccoli, kale, and kohlrabi may seem like very different vegetables, this can't stand on its own as a sentence, right? So what we did was we made this first clause dependent, and you're allowed to link a dependent and an independent clause using only a comma. You don't need a coordinating conjunction when you're linking an independent and dependent clause, right? So now what we did here was we said, okay, now this is now a dependent clause, and this here is still independent, right? So we linked a dependent and an independent clause using a comma. And the way that we made this first clause dependent was using the subordinating conjunction though, okay? So quick recap of coordination versus subordination. Coordination is used when you're linking two independent clauses. And the way that you do it is you use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Subordination is when you're linking an independent and a dependent clause. And the way that you do it is you use a subordinating conjunction and a comma. Okay, now let's take a look at semicolons. Semicolons can be used to link two independent clauses without any conjunction. So let's take a look at some examples. This is incorrect. This is an incorrect use of a semicolon. The green zebra tomato ripens without turning red, which makes it difficult to know when one is ready to eat. This is incorrect because we're linking, this first one is an independent clause, right? But the second one is dependent, right? If you think about it, which makes it difficult to know when one is ready to eat. That's a dependent clause, right? So we can't link an independent and a dependent clause using a semicolon. Semicolons are used to link two independent clauses. This one is also incorrect. The green zebra tomato ripens without turning red, and this makes it difficult to know when one is ready to eat. So if we take this sentence here, we have this independent clause here, right? This is also an independent clause now. This makes it difficult to know when one is ready to eat. That's an independent clause. And we're linking them using a semicolon and a coordinating conjunction, right? This is incorrect because when you're using a semicolon to link two independent clauses, you don't need a coordinating conjunction. You only use a semicolon. So to make this correct, we get rid of this and we just say it like this. A green tomato ripens without turning red. This makes it difficult to know when one is ready to eat. So this would be correct, but when you add the coordinating conjunction, it becomes incorrect. Remember that coordinating conjunctions are used with commas, not semicolons. So another way we could make this correct is if we replace the semicolon with a comma. The green zebra ripens without turning red, and this makes it difficult to know when one is ready to eat. But one thing that we could do to improve this is, although we're using comma and coordinating conjunction to link these, it doesn't really make sense to use and to link these, right? So it might make more sense to use maybe so. The green zebra tomato ripens without turning red, so this makes it difficult to know when one is ready to eat. That might make more sense. Remember, the coordinating conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Those are the coordinating conjunctions. If we go back here, we can see again the reason why the first one is incorrect is because we're linking an independent and dependent clause using a semicolon, whereas semicolon should only be used to link two independent clauses. The second one is incorrect because it's using the semicolon and the coordinating conjunction, but the conjunction is unnecessary in this case. So again, this one is the correct version. We have first independent clause, second independent clause, and they're linked using only a semicolon. All right, how to identify linking clauses questions. When approaching boundaries questions, it's important to identify which standard English conventions are being tested. You may want to look for errors in linking clauses if the choices add or remove commas in fanboys conjunctions, the choices add or remove end punctuation like periods or question marks, any choice contains a semicolon. If you don't see any of these features, then the question likely doesn't deal with linking clauses. Let's look at some examples. Detroit natives Timothy Paul and Nicole Lindsay have combined their two passions, Detroit and beekeeping, to improve the health of their city's flowers and other vegetation. In 2017, the couple converted a vacant lot in the city into N blank. In the years that followed, they acquired 9 additional lots and established more than 35 houses. So if we look at these answer choices, it says which choice completes the text so that it conforms to the conventions of standard English. If we look at these answer choices, right, we can see that we have apiary, comma, apiary, n, right? So let's take this question for a second. Let's actually focus, let's get rid of this first sentence because I want to focus on mainly this second sentence, right? This sentence is already complete, right? We don't really need to focus on that, so I'm going to get rid of it. I'm only going to focus on this sentence. In 2017, the couple converted a vacant lot in the city into and we know that this is going to be an apiary, right? That's the word that they're using, but we don't know really what punctuation we need here. So let's read this again. In 2017, the couple converted a vacant lot in the city into an apiary. And we can see that it would probably make sense to use like some sort of punctuation here. Why don't we go through the examples? So the first choice just uses no punctuation, right? If we read this sentence using no punctuation, in 2017, the couple converted a vacant lot into an apiary. In the years that followed, they acquired. That's a run-on sentence, right? So it wouldn't make sense to do that. Why don't we use a comma? In 2017, the couple converted a vacant lot in the city into an apiary. In the years that followed, they acquired 9 additional lots and established more than 35 hives. Yeah, I can see that sort of making sense. However, I'm pretty sure that this is an independent clause, right? In the years that followed, they acquired 9 additional lots and established more than 35 hives. This is also an independent clause, right? So if we're linking two independent clauses with a comma, then we also need a coordinating conjunction, right? So let's look at the other examples. We have this example which says apiary and, right? So if we do apiary and, although now we do have a coordinating conjunction, we don't have the comma, right? We would want both a comma and a coordinating conjunction to link these two independent clauses. So in 2017, the couple converted a vacant lot in the city into an apiary. This is our first independent clause. Second independent clause, in the years that followed, they acquired 9 additional lots and established more than 35 hives. So that's the second independent clause, right? And notice how we're linking them with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So let's try this answer choice. And that is correct, right? So again, the reason why this one is incorrect, just apiary without any comma, is because that creates, sorry, let me get rid of this highlighting. This is our linking, right? The reason why just having this word and nothing else is wrong is because that creates a run-on sentence, right? The reason why only having a comma is wrong is because you can't link two independent clauses using just a comma. You need a comma and a coordinating conjunction. The reason why this one is wrong is it has a coordinating conjunction and but it doesn't have the comma, right? So we need the comma and coordinating conjunction. And the reason why the last one is correct is because we have this comma and we have the coordinating conjunction. Remember that when you're linking two independent clauses, you need a comma and coordinating conjunction. Top tips. Use the before and after test. When you see choices that offer a variety of punctuation options, check if what comes before and after the blank are independent clauses. If one side of the blank is not an independent clause, then you're likely dealing with a supplements or punctuation question, which focus on different rules. So this tip, I don't think that it's too helpful. I think that the main thing that you should identify when you're dealing with these questions is, are you dealing with an independent or a dependent clause, right? And then based on that, choose your punctuation. And we'll see more examples of that later. Let's take a look at this one. It is tempting to glamorize the hunt for a dinosaur blank. Majority of field work is characterized by a daily routine of heat, insects, and tedious labor. So we can see that we're going to be using, fossils and maybe some commas and transitions here. So let's take this question, this sentence, right? It is tempting to glamorize the hunt for a dinosaur. Let's start with this one. We have fossils. It's tempting to glamorize the hunt for dinosaur fossils. The majority of fieldwork is characterized by a daily routine of heat, insects, and tedious labor. So we can see that this is an independent clause, right? And this one, the majority of fieldwork is characterized by a daily routine of heat, insects, and tedious labor. This is also an independent clause, right? But notice how, again, we're linking it with only a comma. We can't do that. We need a comma and coordinating conjunction. So again, this one would be wrong. The one without a comma, this is also incorrect, right? Now you're linking it with no comma and nor coordinating conjunction. That would be incorrect. Third option, we are using a coordinating conjunction here, right? But we don't have any comma, right? So that's incorrect. Last option, we have the comma and the coordinating conjunction. So if we read this, it is tempting to glamorize a hunt for dinosaur fossils, but the majority of fieldwork is characterized by a daily routine of heat, insects, and tedious labor. This is correct because we have two independent clauses and we're linking it with a comma and coordinating conjunction. So we would choose this one. Let's look at this one. Though Paul Revere is best known today for his midnight ride during the American blank, was famous in his own day as a prosperous silversmith and businessman. So again, let's take this sentence and let's plug in the first one. Revolution and he. Okay, so if we take a look at this sentence, right? Though Paul Revere is best known today for his midnight ride during the American Revolution, this is a dependent clause, right? Now, you may or may not remember that though is a subordinating conjunction, but even if you don't remember that though is a subordinating conjunction, you can just tell by reading this clause that it can't stand on its own as a sentence, right? It wouldn't make sense. Although though is a subordinating conjunction, and remember that subordinating conjunctions will make the clause that comes after dependent, right? So this is a dependent clause. We know that. This is an independent clause. He was famous in his own day as a prosperous silversmith and businessman. This is an independent clause, right? The issue is here that we're linking a dependent and independent clause using a semicolon. Remember that semicolons should be used to link two independent clauses together, not a dependent and independent clause. So that's why this is incorrect. Here we have revolution, comma, but revere. So that one is saying comma, but. So notice how in this case, again, we have a dependent clause and we have an independent clause and we're linking it with a comma and coordinating conjunction. This is also incorrect because you use a comma and coordinating conjunction to link two independent clauses, not a dependent and independent clause. When you're linking a dependent and independent clause, you typically only need a comma. So if we look at this one, it looks like we only have a comma, so comma he. So this seems good, right? Though Paul Revere is best known today for his midnight ride during the American Revolution, he was famous in his own day as a prosperous silversmith and businessman. This is our independent clause, this is our dependent clause, and we're linking it with just a comma. That's correct. And then this one would be incorrect because that would make a run-on sentence. Okay, so that's linking clauses. Let's look at the second section, which is supplements. Supplements are words, phrases, and relative clauses that add extra information to a sentence, often for the purpose of description or elaboration. There are two main types of supplements. Essential elements are necessary for this sentence to function and don't require punctuation. So, for example, in a basketball game, the team that scores the most points will win. So this here in bold is essential information. If you remove that information, the sentence wouldn't make sense, right? So let's take the sentence and remove the essential information, and you just get, in a basketball game, the team will win. That doesn't make sense, right? So this is essential information. The sentence really doesn't make sense without it. So you need that information, and you don't need punctuation or extra punctuation or anything when you're adding essential information, all right? The second type of supplement is non-essential elements. These are not necessary for the sentence to function. They usually add like some extra description or details, but they're not necessary, right? So for example, the basketball team, which won the state championship last year, got on the bus. Notice how this information, although it's helpful to know, it's not needed for the sentence, right? If we get rid of it, the basketball team got on the bus. That's the sentence that makes sense, right? Although it would be helpful to have that extra information, it isn't required, so that is non-essential information. When you're adding non-essential information to the middle of a sentence, you usually use two commas or two dashes or two parentheses, right? Notice how in this case we're using a pair of commas. We could have also used a pair of dashes or a pair of parentheses. The SAT focuses on whether supplements should be separated from the rest of the sentence by punctuation, as well as what punctuation marks should be used. These conventions may be tested in boundaries questions that you encounter on test day. How are supplements punctuated? There are several factors that govern how supplements should be treated within a sentence. Let's look at each in turn. So first, essential or non-essential. The first question is whether a given supplement should be punctuated. Try reading the sentence without the supplemental information. If the sentence no longer makes sense and the supplement is an essential element, no punctuation should be used. If the sentence still makes sense, then the supplement is non-essential. The supplement must be separated from the rest of the sentence by punctuation. So if we go back to this example, again, if you take this part in bold and you remove it, the sentence doesn't make sense anymore, right? That's how you know that that information is required and it's essential information. However, if we take a look at the second example, if you take this information in bold and you remove it, the sentence still makes sense, right? That's how you know that the information isn't required, it isn't needed, so it's non-essential information. And remember that essential information doesn't need punctuation marks, but non-essential information does. Once you determine if a supplement is non-essential, you must decide how to punctuate it. If the supplement begins or ends a sentence, it requires one punctuation mark, which is going to be between the supplement and the rest of the sentence. If the supplement comes in the middle of the sentence, it requires punctuation on both sides. So for example, we have this sentence, right? A striker with 62 goals in international play, Megan Rapinoe is known for activism in addition to our soccer stardom. So notice how this is non-essential information and it's presented at the beginning of the sentence. So whenever we have non-essential information at the beginning of the or end of the sentence, you only need one piece of punctuation. So that's why we only use one comma here. However, in this sentence, Megan Rapinoe, a striker with 62 goals in international play, is known for her activism in addition to her soccer stardom. So notice how, in this case, the non-essential information is being injected into the middle of the sentence. Whenever it's in the middle of the sentence like this, it needs two pieces of punctuation. So one thing that I want to mention, again, I said it before, but I'll say it again. We're using a pair of commas here, this comma, and this comma to add in this non-essential information, right? Again, we could also use two dashes, or you could use a pair of parentheses, right? Any of these works, and they're typically what's used to inject non-essential information in the middle of a sentence. So that's basically what this is saying here. We can use commas, parentheses, and dashes. So in formatting supplements, these punctuation marks are basically interchangeable. However, there's one important rule. The same type of punctuation must appear before and after a non-essential element. So you can't mix and match. If we use a parenthesis on one side, we have to use a parenthesis on the other side. You can't replace this with a comma. If you use a comma on one side, you can't use a dash on the other side, right? So we can't say something like this, right? Because we have a comma and dash. We need to have both commas or both dashes or both parentheses. We can't mix and match them. How to identify supplements questions? When approaching a boundaries question, it's important to identify which standard English conventions are being tested. You may want to look for errors in supplements if the choices add or remove commas but not conjugations. The choices include multiple types of punctuation like commas and dashes. If you don't see either of these features, then the question likely doesn't deal with supplements. Let's look at some examples. Luki is the inaugural poet laureate of the Navajo Nation. Her book, Sani Dahatal, The Women Are Singing, a combination of fiction and memoir, poetry, and blank, serves as a testament to her versatility as a writer. So let's take a look at this sentence, right? Notice this dash. This dash here is, remember, when you're using a dash in the middle of a sentence, you're going to use it to inject non-essential information, right? So we can see that the word that goes in the blank here is prose, right? But the issue is, what punctuation do we have after the prose? Well, remember that when you're using a dash to introduce non-essential information, whenever you're introducing that non-essential information in the middle of a sentence, you're going to need a pair of dashes, right? So we would use another dash here, right? Now if we read the sentence, Luki is the inaugural poet laureate of the Navajo Nation. Her book, The Women Are Singing, a combination of fiction and memoir, poetry and prose, serves as a testament to her versatility as a writer. Notice how we're using a pair of dashes to separate this non-essential information, and notice how if we remove this information, the sentence would still make sense. If I read this again, Luki is the inaugural poet laureate of the Navajo Nation. Her book, The Women Are Singing, serves as a testament to her versatility as a writer. This sentence makes sense, right? But if we add that additional information, it tells us more about her book, The Women Are Singing, right? It tells us a description of that book, so it's helpful to know, but it's not needed for the sentence to make sense. So the correct answer in this case is prose using the dash, right? Because, again, we're using a pair of dashes, one here and one here. Okay, tips. Be consistent. The SAT questions will often include just one side of a non-essential element in the underlined portion of the sentence. Be sure to check the other side of the element for consistency. The same punctuation mark should be used on both sides. Don't worry about the difference between commas, parentheses, and dashes. While commas, parentheses, and dashes are sometimes better in particular contexts, the SAT won't test you on these minor differences. In other words, you'll never be asked to choose between two types of punctuation marks if the choices don't create other grammar errors, so don't sweat it. Don't pair semicolons or colons. Commas, parentheses, and dashes are the only options when separating a non-essential element from the rest of the sentence. We should never use two semicolons or colons around a non-essential element. So that just means that, notice how over here we're using two dashes to separate the non-essential information. We could also use two commas. That could work. Or we could use two parentheses. That also works. However, we can't use two semicolons like this or two colons, right? Like this. That doesn't make sense. Semicolons and colons are not used to separate non-essential information. So again, remember that whenever you're injecting non-essential information in the middle of a sentence, you either use a pair of commas, a pair of dashes, or a pair of semicolons. Or a pair of parentheses. Commas, dashes, parentheses. Those are the three ones that you can use. Let's look at this example. The sandhill blank to North America has the longest fossil history of any extant bird at 10 million years. So let's look at these answer choices. The sandhill crane, a large bird native. So if we just like taking a glance at this, right? It looks like we're introducing non-essential information in the middle of a sentence, right? So if we read it with this, right? Let's actually take the sentence and let's add in the answer choices, right? So if we add in this one, the sandhill crane, a large bird native to North America, that doesn't make sense, right? It would make sense to put a comma here, right? Because then it says the sandhill crane, a large bird native to North America, has the longest fossil history of any extant bird at 10 million years. So notice how this, again, is non-essential information that's introduced or injected in the middle of the text using a pair of commas. And the reason why I know that we have to use a comma on the left side is because they already use a comma on the right side. If you're using a comma on one side, you have to use a comma on the other side as well, right? So that's how we know that this is going to be the correct answer, or this one, right? The reason why this one is incorrect is this one is using two commas, right? If we use this one, if we replace it with C, the sandhill crane, a large bird native to North America, that doesn't make sense. You don't need this comma here. You only need the comma here and the comma here, right? So we're going to go with D. When you put in D, this is a sentence that you get, right? And notice how, again, we have the non-essential information injected in the middle of the sentence using a pair of commas. Let's look at this question. Saint Lucia, a sovereign island in the Caribbean, is the only country in the world named after a historical woman. Again, notice how we're using a dash to introduce non-essential information. So if we're using a dash on one side, we should be using a dash on the other side as well. So that's going to be the correct answer. So that's supplements. That's basically introducing non-essential information in the middle, beginning, or end of sentences. And just keep in mind that although when you're injecting non-essential information in the middle of sentences, you need two commas or two parentheses or two dashes. If it was at the beginning or at the end of the sentence, you only need one, right? So if we go here, remember, a striker with 62 goals in international play, Megan Rapinoe is known for activism in addition to her soccer stardom. Notice how this is non-essential information and we're injecting it in the beginning of the sentence using only one piece of punctuation. So if it's at the beginning or end of the sentence, then you only need one piece. Okay. Last lesson is punctuation. So, what punctuation marks are tested on the SAT? It's going to test commas, semicolons, colons, and dashes. And these are going to be essential to all boundaries questions you encounter on test day. So let's take a look at the different rules and uses of each punctuation mark. So let's start with commas. So commas should only be used to do these things. First, separate list items, right? So crafting a chessboard requires a table saw, a sander, and lots of glue. So that's one use, right? Separate non-essential elements from the sentence. That's the one that we were just doing, right? The Bay of Fundy, a body of water between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, experiences the world's highest tidal range. Notice how we're introducing this non-essential information in the middle of the sentence. So we're using a pair of commas for that. Third use, link dependent clauses to independent clauses. So you can use a comma. Notice how this is a dependent clause, this is an independent clause, and this we're linking it using just a comma. So you can link an independent and dependent clause using only a comma. You can also link two independent clauses using a comma, but you also need a coordinating conjunction. So notice how this here is our first independent clause, this here is our second independent clause, and this here is our comma and coordinating conjunction. So when you're linking two independent clauses using a comma, you need a coordinating conjunction and a comma, right? So commas should not be used to split a subject and verb. So for example, mountain goats are very nimble. That doesn't make sense, right? You don't need a comma in this case. So you could say mountain goats are very nimble. Or you could say mountain goats, which are only distantly related to domestic goats, are very nimble. Notice how this is non-essential information being injected into the middle of the sentence. So that's a correct use for commas. We could use it in that way. Another use is commas come before prepositions. The chicken crossed the road to the other side of the road. That doesn't make sense. Or if you have the chicken crossed to the other side of the road, that doesn't make sense as well, right? Commas aren't needed there. The correct way is the chicken crossed the road to the other side. Sorry, the chicken crossed to the other side of the road. So what this is saying is this is something that a comma should not be used for. They don't need to come before prepositions. Third thing that commas should not be used for is separate items in a list of two. So learning archery requires skill and practice. This is a list of two. There's no need for a comma there. You would just say learning archery requires skill and practice. Those are some uses where commas should not be used. Okay, semicolons should only be used to link independent clauses without a conjunction. We went over that before, but humans have always been troubled by dry skin. This is an independent clause, and lotions and moisturizers have a history of reaching back into ancient times. This is also an independent clause, and we're linking it using only a semicolon, no coordinating conjunction needed. Semicolons can also be used to separate list items that already contain commas. So take a look at this sentence, right? While the United Nations is headquartered in NYC, it also has central offices in Nairobi, Kenya, Geneva, Switzerland, and Vienna, Austria. So the thing is that Nairobi, Kenya, this is a city within the country of Kenya, right? Geneva, Switzerland is also a city within the country of Switzerland, and Vienna, Austria is also a city within the country of Austria, right? But it gets confusing. Like if you read this list, you would think that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You would think that it's 6 separate cities or 6 separate countries, right? But what we want to do is link this one with this one, this one with this one, and this one with this one, right? So then the correct way to do it is the UN has central offices in Nairobi, Kenya. So this, we're linking the city of Nairobi with the country of Kenya, and then we use semicolon to separate the next list item, Geneva, Switzerland, and Vienna, Austria. So notice how we use the commas in this case to indicate that this city is part of this country, and then we use a semicolon to separate the list items. However, they're only needed in cases like these, where if you're already using commas and it gets confusing to separate the list items, then you should use a semicolon, right? But if we go back to like this example, there's no need to use a semicolon here, right? Because if we read the sentence, crafting a chessboard requires a table saw, a sander, and lots of glue. There's no need for semicolons here because commas do the job, right? This makes sense, right? But over here, when we were already using commas to separate the city and country, if we're already using commas to separate the city and country, it gets confusing to use commas to also separate the list items, right? So that's why we use semicolons in this case. So again, those are the only two uses of semicolons: link two independent clauses without a conjunction, and separate list items that already contain commas. All right, colons. Colons can only come at the end of an independent clause. So this is important. Make sure that whenever you see a colon in an SAT question, it only comes after an independent clause. Same thing with semicolons, actually. Semicolons only come, unless they're being used to separate list items, they only come before an independent clause. And also, the clause that comes after a semicolon should be independent. But for colons, the part that comes after doesn't have to be independent, only the part that comes before, right? So these uses, one use for colons is explanations and extra information. So many upstart tech companies fail for the same reason. This is an independent clause, right? And then we use a colon and then we add the extra information, right? Many upstart tech companies fail for the same reason, a lack of market need for their product, right? So this is the extra information coming after the colon, right? This is the independent clause before the colon. Other use is lists. The advent of cellular biology has led to the classification of organisms into three distinct domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotia. So notice how we have this independent clause. Again, the clause before a colon is always needs to be independent, right? And then we have a list after. So those are the only two uses for colons. Dashes should only be used to separate non-essential elements from the rest of the sentence. So in this case, notice how we're using the two dashes to separate non-essential elements, and the non-essential information is injected in the middle of the list, right? So that's why we use a pair of dashes. But in this case, we have a dash separating the non-essential information, but since the non-essential information is at the end of the sentence, we only need one dash. And again, only use dashes for this purpose. Any other use is an error. How to identify punctuation questions? When approaching boundaries questions, it's important to identify which standard English conventions are being tested. You may want to look for errors in punctuation if the choices add or remove punctuation, the choices offer a variety of punctuation marks. If you don't see either of these features, then the question likely doesn't deal with punctuation. Let's look at some examples. According to Naomi Nakayama of the University of Edinburgh, the reason seeds from a dying dandelion appear to float in the air while falling is that their porous plumes enhance drag, allowing the seeds to stay airborne long enough for the wind to disperse them throughout the surrounding area. So let's take a look at these examples, right? We have comma, colon, semicolon, and nothing, right? So let's take a look at this, and so we know that the word here is falling, but we don't know what punctuation we need, right? So let's just go one by one. So let's start with A. So A uses a comma, right? According to Naomi of the University of Edinburgh, the reason seeds from a dying dandelion appear to float in the air while falling is that their porous plumes enhance drag. So this doesn't make sense, right? There's no need for a comma here. It just kind of makes the sentence awkward, right? So I would say that there's no need for a comma here. If we use this colon in answer choice B, right? According to Naomi of the University of Edinburgh, the reason seeds from a dying dandelion appear to float in the air while falling is that their porous plumes enhance drag. So this here, if you like read the sentence before the colon, this isn't an independent clause, right? This can't stand on its own. So remember that you can't use a colon after a dependent clause. It has to come after an independent clause. So this would be incorrect. And even if this was an independent clause, it doesn't make sense, right? Honestly, I'm leaning toward no punctuation needed here, because if you read the sentence without any punctuation, it makes sense, right? According to Naomi of the University of Edinburgh, the reason seeds from a dying dandelion appear to float in the air while falling is that their porous plumes enhance drag, allowing the seeds to stay airborne long enough for the wind to disperse them throughout the surrounding area. That makes sense without any punctuation, right? But we look at the other answer choice C. This is incorrect again, because we can't put a semicolon here since this clause here is dependent, right? So we can't put a semicolon after a dependent clause. It has to be used to separate an independent and an independent clause. So we would use no punctuation in this case. So let's use some tips. Let's look at through some tips. Use a before-after test for semicolons. So unless it appears in a list, a semicolon must have an independent clause both before and after it. If you think a semicolon might be right, check to make sure you have an independent clause on either side. If you don't, you can't use a semicolon. Use the before test for colons. A colon can only appear at the end of an independent clause. If you think a colon might be right, check to make sure what comes before is a complete independent clause. If it's not, you can't use a colon. So for colons, you can have like a list or like a dependent clause after the colon, but the part before the colon has to be an independent clause. For semicolons, both the part before and the part after has to be independent. And then for commas, many writers overuse commas or use them as a default punctuation mark. Double check to make sure a comma is both necessary and appropriate before selecting it as your answer. If the comma is linking clauses, make sure it has a coordinating or subordinating conjunction. It needs to do so. If a comma isn't linking clauses, make sure it serves a purpose and doesn't unnecessarily interrupt some other function of the sentence. Let's take a look at this example. So, an element's atomic number is equal to the number of protons in its nucleus, the number of electrons in its uncharged state, and approximately half of its atomic mass. So, right off the bat, if you plugged in these two answer choices, an element's atomic number is equal to, that part before the colon and the semicolon is not independent, right? So we know that we can't use colon or semicolon. If you use a comma, honestly, that would, like, read the sentence yourself. It seems clunky and it seems unnecessary, right? But reading the sentence without any punctuation at all feels natural, right? It feels correct. So we would use that one, right? So again, the reason why colon and semicolon are incorrect is because the part before is not independent. The reason why comma is incorrect is because we're interrupting the prepositional phrase to the number, right? So if we use a comma in this case, it would interrupt that prepositional phrase. The reason why I didn't go with a comma was just because, again, it seemed like it was not necessary, and when you add it, the sentence seems clunky and doesn't feel correct saying it, right? So in this case, we use no punctuation. Let's look at this example. When he returned from the Galapagos Islands in 1835, Charles Darwin brought back a young tortoise named Harriet. And then we have these answer choices, right? So let's just go one by one. When he returned from the Galapagos Islands in 1835, Charles Darwin brought back a young tortoise named Harriet. She would live over 170 years before passing away at the Australia Zoo in 2006. So, if we use this comma, I'm hesitant to use this comma just because it seems like the clause before, which is when he returned from the islands in 1835, Charles Darwin brought back a young tortoise named Harriet, and also she would live over 170 years before passing away at the Australia Zoo in 2006. This seems incorrect just because I'm pretty sure this is an independent clause before and after, right? And remember that we can't link two independent clauses using only a comma. We need a coordinating conjunction as well, right? So I'm going to hold off on this one. If we use this one, when he returned from the islands in 1835, Darwin brought back a young tortoise named Harriet, who would live over 170 years before passing away at the Australia Zoo. So notice how if we use this word who, this second clause becomes dependent, right? So let me write this. Notice how when we use this word who, this second clause is now dependent, right? If you read this, who would live over 170 years before passing away at the Australia Zoo in 2006, that's a dependent clause, right? If we had she, then this becomes an independent clause, right? This makes sense. She would live over 170 years before passing away at the Australia Zoo. That's an independent clause, right? So we can't link this, again, this first one is independent, but the second one is dependent, right? So we can't link independent and dependent clause using a semicolon. So that's why this B is incorrect. C is incorrect because that would create a run-on sentence, right? D looks correct, right? Because, again, if we replace this who with she, then this is now an independent clause, right? And notice how we're linking this first independent clause and the second independent clause using only a semicolon, right? Remember that semicolon, when you're linking two independent clauses using a semicolon, you don't need coordinating conjunction. So then this would be the correct answer. And again, the reason why the first one is incorrect is because if you replace this with comma, you would need some sort of coordinating conjunction, right? So we could say like, and she would live over 170 years before passing away. This would make sense, right? If you have the coordinating conjunction and comma here, right? But that's not an answer choice, so we would just go with just the semicolon, no coordinating conjunction. So we're linking two independent clauses here using only a semicolon. And that's the correct answer.